You are at a restaurant. The menus arrive. Everyone else scans theirs and orders. You open an app. You type in the dish. You check the calories. You calculate what you have left. Maybe you adjust your order. Maybe you close the app and order what you wanted anyway. But you checked first. You always check first. The person across from you has noticed, but says nothing. They have seen this enough times to know not to mention it. Most people watching this behavior reach for one of two interpretations. Either you are impressively disciplined, or you have an uncomfortable relationship with food you are not yet ready to name. Both of those readings miss the actual psychology, because calorie tracking is not one behavior. It is three completely different behaviors that happen to look identical from the outside. And which one you are doing determines whether the tracking is building something or slowly hollowing something out. Let us start with the version that actually works, the self-regulation version. The one the research consistently supports. Self-regulation theory, grounded in decades of behavioral science, describes self-monitoring as the essential foundation of behavior change. You cannot regulate a behavior you are not observing. A systematic review on self-monitoring and weight loss published in PMC found a consistent and significant association between dietary self-monitoring and weight loss across multiple studies. More frequent tracking produces more weight loss. The evidence is solid. Another study on long-term weight management found that the combination of high frequency and high consistency in dietary tracking was the strongest predictor of both initial weight loss and long-term maintenance. The mechanism is straightforward. Tracking creates a feedback loop between behavior and intention. It closes the gap between what you think you're eating and what you're actually eating. For most people, that gap is much larger than they realize. Research consistently shows that unassisted estimation of caloric intake is unreliable. People underestimate portion sizes. They forget incidental eating. They rationalize high-calorie choices as exceptions that are, in practice, the rule. Tracking removes the distortion. It replaces impression with data. And for the person using it this way, as information, not verdict, it is one of the most effective nutritional tools that exists. This person misses a day of tracking and simply shrugs. They go over their target at a dinner with friends and genuinely enjoy the meal. The number is feedback, not a test of character. They are using the tool. The tool is not using them. But then there is a second type of calorie tracker. And this one is harder to see clearly from the outside because the behavior looks almost identical. This second type is tracking from a place of anxiety, not curiosity. And the difference between those two starting points produces completely different psychological experiences and completely different long-term outcomes. Research on perfectionism and dietary restraint found a unique association between achievement-striving perfectionism and caloric restriction that goes beyond what personality traits alone can explain. In plain terms, for a certain profile of person, tracking calories is not primarily about achieving a body composition goal. It is about managing the discomfort of not knowing, of not being in control of something that feels deeply important. Food, for this person, carries more psychological weight than nutrition. It is entangled with self-worth, with performance, with the fear of getting something wrong that cannot be easily corrected. The daily calorie log is not a tool for this person. It is a containment system, a way of imposing numerical order on something that feels threatening without it. A study on fitness tracking apps and eating disorder tendencies found that higher levels of perfectionism were strongly associated with an increased likelihood of engaging in behaviors linked to disordered eating among calorie tracking app users. The researchers found that perfectionism predicted eating disorder tendencies with a strong effect, beta of 0.62, p less than 0.001. The tracking and the perfectionism were not independent. They were feeding each other. And here is what is important to understand. This person does not think of themselves as having a problem. They think of themselves as having standards, as being serious, as doing what disciplined people do. The anxiety running underneath the tracking is invisible to them because it has been there so long. It feels like motivation. It feels like their personality. It is simply how they are. But discipline and anxiety, while they can look alike on the surface, are psychologically entirely different things. Discipline expands your range. It builds capability and confidence over time. Anxiety dressed as discipline contracts your range. It makes more and more of life feel dangerous without the numbers to contain it. Restaurants become negotiations. Social meals become calculations. Food gradually stops being pleasure and becomes a problem to be managed. Research published in the Journal of Service Research reviewed 65 peer-reviewed articles on health and fitness tracking apps and found that users with high perfectionism and intolerance of uncertainty showed significantly more negative psychological experiences with tracking. They were more likely to feel guilt when they missed a goal, more likely to experience negative emotions when data did not meet expectations, more likely to develop rigid, inflexible thinking about eating and exercise. The app was designed as a health tool. For this user, it had become an anxiety management device with a health aesthetic. Now let us talk about the third type, because this one is arguably the most common and the least examined. The third type of calorie tracker is the person who started tracking for a legitimate reason, got results, and then kept tracking long after the results had arrived. Not because they still need to, because they cannot comfortably stop. A study by Levinson, Fuel, and Brosov, published in Eating Behaviors, surveyed 105 individuals diagnosed with eating disorders. Approximately 75% reported using MyFitnessPal to track calories. Of those users, 73% perceived the app as contributing to their eating disorder. The researchers found that these perceptions were directly correlated with eating disorder severity. The tracking had started as a neutral behavior and, over time, and in the context of certain psychological vulnerabilities, had helped build the disorder it now maintained. A broader systematic review published in Body Image in 2025, examining 38 studies, found that app users were more likely to have disordered eating symptomatology than non-users. Body image concerns and eating worries predicted later app use. The relationship ran in both directions. The tracking was not causing the psychology in these cases. It was amplifying what was already there. And once amplified, it became difficult to separate the tracking from the identity. Who am I if I do not log my meals? The question sounds dramatic, but for someone who has tracked every day for 2 years, it is genuinely uncomfortable to answer. Now, here is the moment in this psychology that almost nobody names clearly, because the people who need to hear this most are the ones who have constructed the most convincing arguments for why their tracking is rational and healthy. The question is not whether you track. The evidence is clear that tracking can work. The question is, what happens to you when you cannot? If you leave your phone at home and eat at a restaurant and genuinely do not care about the numbers, that is a tool you are using. If you leave your phone at home and the meal is quietly contaminated by the knowledge that you are not logging, if you feel vaguely wrong all evening, if you compensate the next day, if there is a low-grade anxiety that follows you until the log is balanced, that is a different situation entirely. In that second situation, the tracking has migrated from the behavior to the identity. You are no longer a person who uses tracking. You have become a person who tracks. And the difference between those two is enormous. Research on self-regulation consistently identifies a specific failure mode in behavioral tracking. When the monitoring itself becomes the goal rather than the underlying behavior change, it was designed to support adherence to tracking replaces adherence to the actual health behavior. In other words, people begin to manage their numbers rather than their health. They become expert in making the app happy rather than in making their body and their relationship to food genuinely better. This is not a criticism of the person. It is a description of what happens when a powerful tool is used beyond the point where it is serving the original purpose. All tools have this failure mode, the spreadsheet that becomes more important than the work it was tracking, the training log that becomes more about the log than the training. With calorie tracking, the failure mode is particularly insidious because the tool looks so much like self-discipline from the outside. Nobody questions it. People praise it. The person doing it is told they are serious and dedicated. And so the pattern reinforces itself. The tracking continues not because it is still serving a purpose, but because the identity around it has become more important than the purpose. There is also something worth naming about what calorie tracking reveals in social contexts. Because the impact on social eating is one of the clearest signals of which type of tracker you are. The person using tracking as a genuine tool can sit at a dinner table and be present. They can order what looks good, enjoy the conversation, and log it later or not at all. The person managing anxiety through tracking is never fully at the table. Part of their attention is always on the calculation. The meal is never just a meal. It is always also a nutritional event to be accounted for, and research has documented this directly. Studies on tracking and social behavior found that for some users, calorie monitoring created patterns of social isolation. Avoiding meals with friends because the restaurant was incompatible with the log, declining social invitations because managing the food was more stressful than the social reward was worth. Food is not just fuel. In every human culture across all of recorded history, eating together has been one of the deepest expressions of social connection. To reduce it entirely to numbers is to lose something that has no caloric equivalent. None of this is an argument against tracking. The self-regulation research is clear and consistent. For the right person, used correctly, dietary tracking is one of the most effective behavioral tools in nutrition science. But the right person brings security to the numbers. The numbers inform them. They do not govern them. The person who can pick up the tracking when it serves a purpose and put it down when it does not, who can eat freely at a celebration and log with precision during a physique-focused phase, is using the tool at its full potential. That flexibility, that ability to move between tracking and not tracking without anxiety, is actually the psychological goal, not the calorie number, not the streak, not the perfect log. Because the most precise dietary log in the world does not tell you what kind of relationship you have with food. Only the moment when you close the app and eat freely can tell you that. If this made you think honestly about what your tracking is actually doing for you, subscribe and hit the bell for more psychology that goes deeper than the numbers.